Can we finally put a stop to forced labor in China? Sean Beman is assistant professor of supply chain and information management at Northeastern University. Hello, Sean.
Hello, Bob. Nice to be with you.
Yeah, thanks for being with me too. Sean, how good a job are we doing right now in detecting incidents of forced labor and other violations of human rights in global supply chains?
It's interesting because it depends on which country you're looking at. You started off with China in your lead, and I would say in China, it's particularly difficult, mostly because audits can't be trusted in that area. So we know that if we find an auditing firm that might say, yes, it's okay, it can't actually be the ground truth, which is what we need from an audit. Other parts of the world, we're actually doing significantly better, I would say, because we have worker voice as part of the supply chain process. We can actually speak with workers at facilities and factories. We can do randomized visits. We can create secondments where people actually work in those facilities and we know what's happening on the ground.
Mhm.
But to your initial line, I would say in China, it's really difficult. And even for goods that we import into the United States, it's very difficult to identify and to stop all of the goods that are coming from China that are made with Uyghur forced labor.
Well, it seems somewhat ironic given the fact that it's no secret what's going on in the Uyghur region. It's been heavily publicized, and yet we still haven't put a stop to it. Why not? Other than, I mean, you mentioned
From
it's difficult because of China's, the natural inability to get visibility of that. But can you talk to me more about just why we haven't been able to get our arms around this problem yet?
I think there's multiple sides to the problem. I'm going to put to the side the political aspects because I think that plays a role. And I'm going
Hmm.
to focus on the supply chain aspects, which I think are more relevant for this conversation.
Okay.
From a supply chain perspective, knowing internal movement within China and then how products go from the East Coast of China to places like the United States requires tracing, it requires investigation, and it requires a depth of due diligence that I would say most companies are not familiar with because it is so detailed, so involved, and in some cases requires advanced training. Now,
Mm.
CBP, Customs and Border Protection, has been doing a great job at stopping some of those shipments. We know that as of today, $2.8 billion worth of goods have been stopped at the border of the United States ever since the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act was passed. And so CBP has stepped up their enforcement, but actually mitigating situations on the ground in China is difficult because of the political situation that I mentioned, where it is the current government's idea that they should implement these types of policies on a minority population.
Hmm. Not to mention the difficulty of ascertaining if you're a consumer whether a particular product that you are buying was indeed produced there. It doesn't say it might say made in China, but it's certainly not going to tell you where. So that's still a problem, is it not?
Absolutely. And even if it says made in India, made in Sri Lanka, made in Indonesia, those raw materials, the cotton that goes behind the apparel, could still be coming from China and
Hmm.
specifically from the Uyghur region, where over 1 million people are currently being detained in situations of forced labor. And so, no matter what country it's coming from, it requires multi-tier knowledge in the supply chain to understand, well, are we buying forced labor goods anyways, even if it's from a third party country? Because
Yeah.
often we see that being the case.
And as we understand it, 80% of cotton coming from China is banned from entering the US. So that gives us an idea of the scale of the problem, does it not? It's huge.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
even the most recent estimate's 89%. It's gone up
Oh,
since the last estimates.
wow.
And so it's by far the majority of cotton coming from China.
So let's talk about state-of-the-art solutions, Sean, specifically Supply Trace. Could you describe to me exactly what that platform is all about and how that might help us to achieve the goal of stopping imports from the Uyghur region and any other place where human rights are being violated?
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks for that. So Supply Trace is an open access platform that allows for anybody, anywhere, to understand how the products we buy might be made with forced labor. It's very simple in that way. It provides you a world map, kind of like how you would search a map for a destination that you're trying to get to. And you could actually look at specific companies, factories, or product types if you look by HS code and understand which of those are at risk for using forced labor. In our pilot, which launched last week, we're looking specifically at forced labor from the Uyghur region. As we go
Mhm.
forward throughout the year, we'll expand to other regions and not only cotton apparel, which is what we're focused on now, but expand beyond cotton to other types of industries as well. We
Mhm.
don't do this completely ourselves. I should say the bulk of the data that's analyzed is import data using machine learning, so imports and exports in and out of the United States. But we do this in concert with a group of Uyghur researchers who are trained to investigate facilities. They themselves are the victims of oppression who have turned that around, left that region, and now are internationally located where they can investigate facilities, tag evidence for the specific facilities that are linked to Uyghur forced labor, and we bridge that connection between the investigation and the shipment to say this shipment into the United States came from this at risk facility. And this
Mhm.
deserves more due diligence. This deserves more analysis to understand why this is happening. Why are products still entering the United States made with Uyghur forced labor? And what can we do about it going forward?
Well, you say these investigators have left China, as of course they would need to in order to keep from being in prison for the information that they're giving, but they're not on the ground there anymore. So how do you get that level of intelligence about what's actually happening in those factories right now?
There's an assortment of evidence that we use. And I should be clear, all evidence for every facility is on the website. So for each facility, you can actually access the raw evidence. That includes public disclosures by the facilities if they're involved in quote unquote poverty alleviation programs, which
Mhm.
is a pseudonym for government oppression in China, where they're trying to retrain people like us, journalists, professors, and others, as agricultural workers, which is far beyond the pale for what anybody would consider humane conditions or humane treatment. So public disclosures of being involved in those situations. They're also looking for signs of corporate ownership. So is a factory owned by a larger company that is known to be investing in Xinjiang, specifically in regions where there are forced labor or industrial camps that are using Uyghur forced labor and making those types of connections. And they're looking for those types of evidence to be able to create a risk profile
Mhm.
on those factories to say, these factories have publicly shown that they are involved in this and therefore deserve a closer look, deserve more intelligence put on them. And we provide access to all of those records to anybody who visits the website to learn more about it.
And for those that have not publicly disclosed, even more difficult to get information about them, right? How do you do that?
For any facility where there is no credible evidence, we do not tag them as an at risk facility because we,
I
as
see.
academics, believe in citations and ensuring that we're true to the credibility of any documentation that we can find. With that being said, the reason that we work with this group of investigators is because there is more than enough evidence to find thousands of facilities that are involved in this. And so when you look at the platform, you're actually on the back end able to access upwards of 17,000 currently, but going on 25,000 facilities that are known to be linked with this type of oppression in China.
Do you work with NGOs in terms of getting additional intelligence about what's going on, or in any way cooperate with existing NGOs or dedicated to human rights protection?
We do liaise with a series of NGOs to
Mhm.
provide us feedback on the platform to make sure it's useful for them. The platform itself, it takes a different position than I would say most other platforms in this space. First of all, because it's open access. Secondly, because it's expert led. So we're experts in forced labor and investigations. But third, because we're not trying to name or shame any companies in doing this. For US brands, we see this as a way for them to be able to understand their risk profiles, to be able to ask the tough questions of their supply chain, and to know if they're potentially linked to what's happening across the world and make better decisions. I come at it as a former procurement person to say, this is the tool I wish I would have had when I worked in corporate procurement to be able to just easily search, are any of my entities in my supplier list at risk? And if so, how can I take action to alleviate that?
Mhm. But for those brands that do not take adequate steps to protect themselves against this type of, forced labor and are continue to produce goods in China, does this not serve as a means, at least from the consumer standpoint, of quote unquote naming and shaming from is a necessary step?
I think you could see it as a way that anybody anywhere could access that type of potential risk, whether that be consumers, it could be governments that
Mhm.
access the same data because anyone has access to supply trace. And anybody can run a trace on any US brand. Right now, it's focused on apparel, but it'll expand to other brands as well. So, yes, it could be used to identify that even of companies that are not trying to remediate or to take action in their supply chains. But I think that's maybe the same thing as saying, what can you do with a hammer? You could build something better, or you could take something apart. It's a tool. This allows
Hmm.
for us to begin to trace, I think for the first time in supply chain history, begin to trace any supply chain and who they buy from. That's in my historical analysis, that's never existed in our space, which to me is groundbreaking. And so I'm excited for the fact that the tool could be used for any host of reasons.
Can it take you all the way back to the beginning of a supply chain, even beyond the factory? Can it take you back to the mine, to the farm, to the raw materials production, stuff like that? Or will it at some point?
We do have multi-tier algorithms. So it will trace from the US back to potentially a third party country, then to China, if that was the case. And we are starting to analyze and make available internal China data. This hasn't gone live yet, but this is the tier 4 connections that we've been tracing inside of China to say whether or not that can be linked back to the bale of cotton before it actually left the East Coast.
Mm.
That will be coming in the future of supply trace. It's the data that we have been analyzing and making sure that we feel it is ready to go prime time on the website before we launch it.
And what is your hope for a timetable expanding the tool beyond the pilots that relate to China to the rest of the world?
We actually have an accelerated timetable for that. So in the next year, you'll see us go beyond China and you'll see us go beyond apparel. And in that way, you'll be able to start accessing supply trace tools for at least one or more other industries, one or more other countries. And really, the goal long term is to be able to trace supply chains in total. You mentioned who we partner with, NGOs or otherwise. We actually tried to be respectful of data from all sorts of data partners or potential partners to say, what would they like for the world to visualize? What would they like for the world to trace? So that way we can make that accessible and then cite them as the source and say, this NGO or this company or this firm is the one that provided this data so
Hmm.
that they can go and speak with them and learn more about the product.
Right. So you're not possessive about where the information comes from, as long as it has the effect, the desired effect. Yeah.
And as long as it's authoritative knowledge, yes.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, we will link to supply trace in the notes to this video. Professor Sean Beman of Northeastern University, I want to thank you so much for describing this tool for us and the idea that it might give us some hope in finally getting our arms around this problem of human rights violations and forced labor in China and everywhere in the world for that matter. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Bob. I appreciate your time.